The Grand Harlow estate stood on the outskirts of New York, a sprawling mansion with towering gates and manicured lawns that seemed to stretch for miles. Inside, the atmosphere was always thick with tension, though most visitors never sensed it. To the outside world, the Harlows were an impeccable family, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. But Eleanor, the family's longtime housekeeper, knew better. Eleanor Harper had been working for the Harlow family for nearly 30 years. She was a woman of few words, moving through the house with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago accepted her place in the world. Her once bright auburn hair had faded to gray, tied back in a neat bun, and her hands were rough from years of scrubbing, polishing, and cleaning. Still, there was something dignified in the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that those in the household either overlooked or never bothered to acknowledge. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was the silent witness to the life of the Harlow family. Eleanor had seen it all, their triumphs, their secrets, their failures. Richard Harlow, the patriarch of the family, had inherited the Harlow empire from his father and expanded it beyond imagination. A self-made billionaire in the truest sense, he had built industries, forged alliances, and crushed competition with a ruthless efficiency. But in private, Richard was distant, often absent, as if his wealth weighed too heavily on him. He was a man shaped by power, but he seemed to always be in the shadow of something darker. Then there was Vanessa Harlow, his wife. Where Richard was cold and detached, Vanessa was fiery and sharp-tongued. She had grown up in privilege, the daughter of a prominent socialite, and married Richard in what had been described as the wedding of the decade. She had been young and full of ambition, and now, years later, she ruled the Harlow household like a queen. To Eleanor, Vanessa was a figure of cruelty masked behind perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes. She had the looks of a movie star and the heart of a viper, never missing an opportunity to assert her dominance over those she deemed beneath her. This morning, like every morning, Eleanor moved swiftly through the mansion, her footsteps barely audible against the marble floors. She had already prepared the breakfast, a meticulous spread of fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee. As she entered the dining room, she found Richard sitting at the head of the table, hidden behind the morning's edition of the New York Times, as was his habit. His salt and pepper hair was combed back, his suit impeccable even though he wasn't leaving the house for another few hours. Vanessa entered moments later, her heels clicking loudly on the floor, her phone in hand. She didn't look up, her eyes glued to the screen as she tapped out a message with perfectly manicured nails. Her perfume wafted through the air, a sickly sweet scent that filled the room as Eleanor moved to pour her a cup of coffee. Vanessa barely acknowledged her presence, though Eleanor could feel her gaze brush over her for just a moment, like she was checking to make sure the help was doing its job. Eleanor, Vanessa's voice sliced through the silence like a knife, cold and sharp. Tonight's event is extremely important. The mayor, some of Richard's business associates, even a few actors will be here. Make sure everything is spotless. I don't want any embarrassments. Eleanor nodded quietly. Of course, Mrs. Harlow. She was used to Vanessa's imperious tone. It had been like this for years. Commands given, no pleasantries exchanged. Eleanor knew better than to expect kindness. She had long since stopped hoping for any. But Vanessa wasn't finished. And don't forget the silver. I noticed fingerprints on the serving tray last time. Absolutely unacceptable. If there's one thing I despise, it's incompetence. Incompetence. The word lingered in the air, stinging Eleanor as she poured Vanessa's coffee, her hand trembling for just a moment before she steadied herself. Yes, Mrs. Harlow, Eleanor replied, her voice even, her face betraying nothing. But inside, something twisted. Eleanor had spent decades keeping her thoughts to herself, maintaining the perfect facade of the obedient housekeeper. But today, the weight of Vanessa's words felt heavier than usual. As Eleanor turned to leave the dining room, her eyes fell briefly on the family portrait hanging on the wall. It was a massive painting, larger than life, showing Richard, Vanessa, and their two children, Emma and Harrison. They looked so happy in the portrait, so perfect. But Eleanor knew the truth. She had seen behind the smiles, had witnessed the cracks in their facade. Eleanor had been there when Emma, the youngest daughter, had her first breakdown. Richard had ignored it, too focused on a business deal. Vanessa had blamed Eleanor, accusing her of not paying enough attention. Eleanor had been there when Harrison had dropped out of college and gone missing for days on end. The media never found out, of course. The Harlows had an image to maintain, and they were experts at controlling what the public saw. For years, Eleanor had buried her own emotions, her own memories, beneath the routine of her work. She had become an invisible fixture in the house, a ghost in her own right. But deep down, she had always known that her past and the Harlow family were intertwined in ways no one could ever imagine. As she made her way back to the kitchen, preparing for another day of servitude, a thought gnawed at her. Tonight's party would be just like all the others, elegant, extravagant, and dripping with the illusion of perfection. But Eleanor had secrets she had vowed to take to her grave. She glanced at the grandfather clock ticking away in the hallway. The day was just beginning, but something in the air felt different. The years of silence were becoming unbearable, the weight of the past too heavy to ignore. Soon, the truth would have to come out. The evening descended on the Harlow estate like a velvet curtain, and with it came the anticipation of yet another glamorous event. The mansion had been transformed into a scene from a high society dream. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors, and waitstaff dressed in crisp uniforms glided between the guests carrying trays of champagne. In the kitchen, Eleanor stood at the sink, her hands working methodically as she washed the last of the silverware. The air in the house hummed with the chatter of New York's elite, and though she had been present for countless such events, tonight felt different. There was an edge to the atmosphere, a sharpness to the way Vanessa had spoken to her earlier, as though something larger was simmering beneath the surface. From the other side of the kitchen door, Eleanor could hear the rise and fall of laughter, the clink of glasses, the familiar sounds of wealth and privilege on display. It was a world she had lived in for years but never been a part of, a world that revolved around appearances, around people like Vanessa Harlow, who thrived on the validation of others. Eleanor turned off the water, wiping her hands on a dish towel just as the kitchen door swung open and one of the young servers hurried in. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat on his brow. "Mrs. Harlow wants the silver tray for the dessert table now," he stammered, barely meeting Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor nodded, setting down the towel and reaching for the tray she had just finished polishing. She held it in her hands for a moment, staring at her reflection in the smooth surface. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper, her face more tired than she had noticed before. With a small sigh, she handed the tray to the server. As he disappeared back into the crowd, Eleanor remained behind, lingering in the quiet of the kitchen. She had spent the better part of her life in these rooms, these hallways, and yet she had never felt more isolated. She knew every inch of the Harlow estate. The creak in the third step of the grand staircase, the small crack in the marble of the entryway floor that Vanessa had ordered covered with a rug. But despite that, she might as well have been a ghost. Vanessa's voice rang out suddenly, cutting through the low murmur of the party. Eleanor stiffened, recognizing the tone immediately. Sharp, condescending. "Eleanor," Vanessa called, her voice carrying into the kitchen. "Get out here." The guests turned their heads as Eleanor stepped into the grand ballroom. It was like walking onto a stage. Every eye followed her as she moved toward Vanessa, who stood at the center of the room, her red silk gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. Vanessa's lips were pressed into a thin line, and in her hand, she held a glass of wine that sloshed precariously near the edge. "Tell me, Eleanor," Vanessa began, her voice dripping with venom. "What exactly were you thinking when you prepared this spread?" She gestured to the table, laden with hors d'oeuvres and intricate desserts, the kind of lavish display Eleanor had overseen dozens of times. But tonight, Vanessa had found something to pick apart, something to turn into a spectacle. Eleanor's heart quickened, but her face remained impassive. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harlow. What seems to be the issue?" Vanessa turned toward her guests, who were now watching with thinly veiled amusement, eager for a moment of drama in an otherwise predictable evening. "The issue," Vanessa drawled, "is that the napkins aren't folded correctly. They're uneven." She waved her hand dismissively at the table, as if the entire setup was a personal affront. It's sloppy. I mean, really, after all these years, I would have thought you'd know how to do something as basic as this. A low murmur spread through the room, a few guests exchanging knowing glances. They had seen this before, Vanessa's penchant for turning minor inconveniences into public humiliations. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of embarrassment rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. She had been through worse than this. "I'll fix it immediately, Mrs. Harlow," she said calmly, stepping toward the table. But Vanessa wasn't finished. She wasn't interested in a solution. She wanted to make an example of Eleanor, to remind everyone who held the power in this house. She stepped forward, blocking Eleanor's path, her eyes flashing with something cold and malicious. "You always make mistakes, don't you, Eleanor?" Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've been here for how long now? And yet you still can't get it right. How is that possible?" The room fell silent. Even Richard, who had been engaged in a conversation across the room, looked up from his drink, his brow furrowed slightly as he watched the scene unfold. Vanessa's words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Eleanor froze, her hands clenched at her sides. The weight of Vanessa's cruelty pressed down on her, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had spent so many years serving this family, giving up pieces of herself along the way, all for this. The constant belittlement, the unspoken but ever-present reminder that she was nothing more than the help. Vanessa smirked, satisfied with Eleanor's silence, and turned to her guests. "Can you believe it? All this time, and she still doesn't know her place." The laughter that followed was light, almost hesitant, as if the guests weren't sure how far they could indulge Vanessa's cruelty without appearing unkind themselves. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears, the anger and humiliation bubbling up inside her. She felt her hands begin to tremble, the room closing in around her. She had been trained to hold her tongue, to endure. But tonight was different. Tonight, something inside her snapped. Without thinking, Eleanor's voice broke through the laughter. "Maybe it's not about knowing my place, Mrs. Harlow," she said, her voice steady but low. The room went still. "Maybe it's about how long someone like you can hold on to yours." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Vanessa's eyes widened, caught off guard for the first time in years. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, Eleanor stood taller. The room seemed to shift, the years of silence and servitude falling away. This wasn't just about napkins. This was about something much deeper, about the secret she had buried for so long, the truth she had kept hidden, even as Vanessa had treated her like an invisible servant. But not for much longer. Eleanor looked around the room at the sea of stunned faces, then turned back to Vanessa, her expression unreadable. The night had only just begun, and as Eleanor walked back into the kitchen, she knew one thing for certain. The balance of power in the Harlow household was about to change forever. The night was supposed to have been flawless, a testament to Vanessa Harlow's flawless reign as the perfect hostess. But now, just an hour after the heated exchange in front of the guests, a charged tension buzzed through the Harlow mansion. The air, once filled with polite laughter and clinking glasses, felt thicker, as though everyone sensed the seismic shift that had begun with Eleanor's defiant words. In the grand living room, guests were still mingling, though the mood was subdued. People whispered in small groups, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected confrontation they had witnessed. They were too polite to mention it outright, but the ripple effect was undeniable. Richard Harlow, standing with his business associates near the fireplace, kept glancing across the room toward Vanessa, who was still fuming, her smile forced as she spoke to an oblivious politician. Eleanor, meanwhile, had retreated to the kitchen. She stood by the large oak table, her hands resting on its surface as she steadied herself. Her heart was racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had always been the quiet one, the obedient servant who knew her place. But in that moment, standing in front of the people who had belittled her for so many years, something inside her had snapped. The words had left her lips before she could stop them, and now there was no taking them back. She exhaled slowly, her breath shaky, and looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but it wasn't fear that made them shake. It was something else, something deeper. For the first time in decades, Eleanor felt a flicker of power. It was fleeting, but it was there. As she reached for a glass of water, the door to the kitchen burst open and Vanessa stormed in, her heels clacking loudly against the tiled floor. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes narrowing as they locked onto Eleanor. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Vanessa spat, her voice venomous. "How dare you humiliate me in front of our guests like that?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She placed the glass on the counter, slowly turning to face Vanessa. The years of enduring Vanessa's cruelty had prepared her for moments like this. But tonight, she was no longer the same quiet, submissive housekeeper. "I didn't humiliate you, Mrs. Harlow," Eleanor said calmly, her voice steady. "You did that all by yourself." Vanessa's mouth twisted into a sneer, her fists clenching at her sides. "You're nothing. Nothing but a servant who's been allowed to stay here out of the goodness of my heart. Don't forget that." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. The years of servitude, the silence, the sacrifices, none of it mattered anymore. Because the truth she had buried for so long was about to come out, and once it did, everything would change. For all of them. "You don't know the truth, Vanessa," Eleanor said softly, almost sadly. "But you're about to." Vanessa stared at her, confused for a moment. Then her expression darkened. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of the years pressing down on her. She had spent so long hiding this secret, believing it was for the best. But tonight, after Vanessa had publicly humiliated her for the last time, Eleanor couldn't bear to keep it hidden any longer. Not when the truth had been gnawing at her for so many years. "I kept quiet because I thought it was what you needed," Eleanor began, her voice filled with a deep sadness. "Because I thought it would protect you. But I see now that the truth is what you deserve, whether you want it or not." Vanessa took a step forward, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "You're not making any sense, Eleanor. What are you talking about?" The kitchen felt smaller now, the air charged with an intensity that seemed to pull the two women into an invisible vortex. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists as she prepared herself for what she was about to reveal. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but the reality of it was far more terrifying. But there was no going back now. "Vanessa," Eleanor said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I am your mother." The words hung in the air between them, like a heavy fog that neither of them could see through. For a moment, Vanessa didn't react. Her perfectly made-up face remained frozen in place, her eyes blinking as though she hadn't fully processed what she had just heard. The room was deathly quiet. And then, slowly, Vanessa's expression twisted into one of disbelief. A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "What? Are you insane?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You're what?" Eleanor's eyes softened, and she took a step forward, her heart breaking for the daughter she had been forced to abandon so long ago. "I gave you up when you were just a baby," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I was young, and I didn't have a choice. The Harlows, they forced me to give you away. But I never stopped thinking about you." Vanessa's face was a mask of fury and confusion, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. You're lying," she said, shaking her head. "You can't be. You're not my—" "I am," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "You were born when I worked here, for the Harlows. Your father. He was someone I loved, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't keep you. They made me give you up for adoption, and I've regretted it every day since." Vanessa's face went pale, her fingers trembling as they reached up to touch her lips. Her entire world was spinning out of control. Her carefully constructed life, the identity she had worn like armor, was crumbling around her. "You're lying," Vanessa repeated, though the conviction in her voice was slipping. "Why would you say this now? Why didn't you tell me before?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter, the child she had lost so many years ago. "Because I thought it was best for you. The Harlows adopted you, gave you everything I couldn't. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I see that it wasn't." Vanessa stumbled back a step, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes wide with shock and horror. "This can't be real," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're just the help." "I'm more than that, Vanessa," Eleanor whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm your mother." Vanessa let out a sob, her carefully maintained composure shattering. The guests in the other room continued their conversations, unaware of the emotional earthquake taking place in the kitchen. But for Vanessa, the world had stopped. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her family, was a lie. And now, standing before her, was the one person she had never expected, the woman she had belittled, ignored, and tormented for years. Her mother. Vanessa's legs gave out, and she slumped into the nearest chair, her head in her hands, sobs racking her body. Eleanor stepped forward, instinctively reaching out, but she stopped herself, unsure if Vanessa would want her comfort. The silence between them was deafening, but the truth had been unleashed. There was no going back now. Vanessa Harlow's perfect world had just been shattered, and Eleanor Harper, the mother she never knew she had, was the one who had broken it. The kitchen felt frozen in time, the air thick with the weight of the revelation. Eleanor stood a few feet from Vanessa, her heart heavy with decades of suppressed emotion, while Vanessa sat slumped in the chair, her face buried in her hands, shaking with silent sobs. The world she had built for herself, the Harlow name, the wealth, the power, now felt like a fragile illusion, shattered by the truth that Eleanor had just revealed. Eleanor had spent years preparing for this moment in her mind, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. Seeing Vanessa, her daughter, crumble in front of her was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The kitchen, usually bustling with staff, felt like a hollow shell around them. The distant hum of the party in the other room an eerie reminder that life outside this moment still carried on. Vanessa's breath was uneven, sharp gasps breaking the silence as she tried to process what she had just heard. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face a portrait of disbelief and rage. "How could you?" Vanessa's voice trembled, a mix of anguish and fury. "How could you keep this from me for so long? All these years, you..." Her words caught in her throat, as if they were too painful to even say. She looked at Eleanor as though seeing her for the first time, her eyes filled with a raw mixture of betrayal and confusion. Eleanor took a tentative step closer, but Vanessa recoiled, her body stiffening in her chair. The gesture hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but she kept her voice steady, her tone soft, almost pleading. "I thought it was the right thing to do, Vanessa. I thought I was protecting you. You were adopted into a life of privilege, something I could never have given you. The Harlows, they..." Vanessa cut her off, her voice sharp and angry now. "The Harlows raised me, yes. They gave me everything I have. And you stayed here, working for them, watching me grow up, and you never said a word?" The accusation hung in the air, and Eleanor's heart ached with guilt. She had no defense that would make this right. "I wanted to tell you, so many times," Eleanor whispered. "But how could I? You didn't even know who I was. I was just the housekeeper. I thought it would be better this way." Vanessa let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Better," she spat. "You let me treat you like nothing. You let me walk around this house, pretending to be someone I'm not, while you just..." She choked on the words, her voice breaking as the enormity of the situation crashed over her. "How could you do that to me?" Eleanor swallowed hard, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Because I didn't know how to fix it," she admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of the years. "I didn't know how to be your mother again after all this time. I thought it was too late." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa stared at Eleanor, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, her mind racing through a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to deny everything Eleanor had said, but deep down, some part of her knew it was true. She could feel it, in a way that shook her to her core. And then came the memories, small, fleeting moments that she had always ignored or explained away. The way Eleanor had always seemed to watch her with a kind of quiet sadness. The time she had caught Eleanor looking at her with eyes filled with something deeper than a mere servant's duty. Vanessa had never questioned it before, never cared to understand the woman who lived in the background of her life. But now, with the truth staring her in the face, those memories took on a different meaning. "You should have told me," Vanessa said, her voice barely above a whisper now, filled with a deep, aching sorrow. "You should have told me a long time ago." "I know," Eleanor replied softly, her voice breaking. "I know. I'm so sorry, Vanessa." The sound of Eleanor's apology cut through the tension like a knife. Vanessa closed her eyes, her mind overwhelmed by the tidal wave of emotions that threatened to drown her. She had spent years building her identity as Vanessa Harlow, the glamorous wife of a billionaire, the queen of New York's elite. But now, all of it felt hollow, meaningless. Who was she, really, if everything she had believed about her past was a lie? Just then, the kitchen door creaked open, and Richard Harlow stepped in, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. He had been watching from a distance, sensing that something was wrong. The moment he saw the two women in the kitchen, Vanessa on the verge of collapse, Eleanor with tears in her eyes, he knew this was not an ordinary argument. "What's going on here?" Richard's deep voice filled the room, his brow furrowed as he looked from Vanessa to Eleanor. "What's happened?" Vanessa looked up at her husband, her eyes red and puffy. For a moment, she didn't speak. She couldn't find the words. The weight of the truth had paralyzed her. But then, she pointed a shaking finger at Eleanor, her voice hoarse. "She's my mother." Richard blinked, stunned, as the words hung in the air. "What?" he breathed, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor, still standing in the middle of the kitchen, felt her pulse quicken as Richard's gaze turned to her. She knew this moment was inevitable, that Richard would find out the truth sooner or later. But now that it was happening, she felt the full gravity of what she had set into motion. "It's true," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm Vanessa's biological mother. I gave her up when she was a baby, and the Harlows adopted her. I've been working here all these years, but I never told her." Her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat. Richard's face turned pale as the truth began to sink in. He glanced at Vanessa, then back at Eleanor, struggling to process what he was hearing. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Why didn't you?" He paused, his expression hardening as the realization hit him. "You've been keeping this from us all these years?" Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. "I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought I was protecting her." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. "Protecting me? You've been lying to me. You both have." The room fell silent again, the tension suffocating. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the bombshell that had just been dropped on them. Vanessa, his wife, the woman he had built a life with, wasn't who she thought she was. And Eleanor, the woman he had employed for decades, had been hiding the truth from him all along. For the first time in his life, Richard Harlow had no idea what to do. Eleanor took a shaky breath, stepping forward. "I know I've hurt you both," she said, her voice trembling, "and I can't undo what's been done. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving her. I gave her up because I thought it was the only way. But I'm still her mother. I've always been her mother." Vanessa, still sitting in the chair, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her body trembling. She looked at Eleanor, her heart torn between anger and the deep, desperate need for answers. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why tell me this now?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Because I couldn't bear to stay silent any longer. Not after everything. You deserve to know the truth. And so do I." The weight of Eleanor's words hung heavy in the air. Vanessa looked down at her hands, her mind spinning. She had spent her entire life building an identity that now felt like a lie. But as she looked at Eleanor, the woman who had silently watched over her for years, she realized something she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure who she hated more, Eleanor for keeping the secret, or herself for not seeing it sooner. Vanessa sat motionless, the weight of Eleanor's confession still pressing down on her chest like a vice. Richard stood nearby, silent and stiff, his gaze darting between his wife and the woman who, until moments ago, had been nothing more than a servant in his eyes. But now, Eleanor's revelation had turned their lives upside down. The tension in the room was suffocating. Vanessa's mind spun in a chaotic blur, each thought colliding with the next. Her mother, Eleanor, this woman who had silently served her, who had witnessed every high and low of her life, was her mother. The words felt foreign, incomprehensible. Richard was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with frustration and disbelief. How could you keep something like this from us? His eyes bored into Eleanor, his expression a mix of shock and betrayal. How could you stand there all these years, watching us, pretending like you were just the help? Eleanor held Richard's gaze, her own eyes reflecting the deep remorse she had carried for so long. I didn't pretend, she said quietly. I did what I thought I had to do. I was never pretending to be your housekeeper, Richard. I was your housekeeper, because that's all I was allowed to be. Richard's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Vanessa, who was still staring blankly at the floor. Vanessa, he said softly, as though trying to pull her back to the present. What do you want to do? How do we even move forward from something like this? But Vanessa didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was still trying to untangle the mess of emotions inside her. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, betrayal. It all came crashing down at once. She looked up slowly, her tear-streaked face contorted with a mixture of pain and rage. You, Vanessa's voice was barely a whisper at first, but it grew louder as the words tumbled out. You've been here all these years, just watching me, knowing the whole time, and you said nothing? Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. What could she possibly say that would make any of this better? The truth was out, but the damage had already been done. Vanessa stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her temples. She let out a bitter, strangled laugh, her whole body shaking with the force of her emotions. I've spent my entire life living this lie, she choked out, and you just let it happen. I didn't let it happen. Eleanor's voice finally broke through, filled with years of pent-up sorrow and guilt. I was forced to give you up. You think this was easy for me? You think I wanted this life for you, or for me? I've regretted it every single day, Vanessa. Every single day. Vanessa's heart clenched, hearing the raw emotion in Eleanor's voice. But it wasn't enough to stop the tidal wave of anger that surged through her. You could have told me. You could have done something. Instead, you just stood by, watching me grow up, watching me become someone I'm not, and you never said a word. You let me hate you. Eleanor flinched at that, but she didn't back down. And what would you have done, Vanessa? If I had told you when you were a child, would you have believed me? Would you have accepted it? You were raised by the Harlows, with their name, their privilege. I thought it was the only way for you to have a good life. A life better than what I could have given you. Vanessa shook her head, backing away as if Eleanor's words were too much to bear. Don't you dare say you did this for me. Don't you dare. Richard stepped forward, his hand hovering over Vanessa's shoulder, unsure if he should touch her or if she needed space. His own mind was reeling from the revelation, but he was more concerned about the woman in front of him, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. Vanessa, please, he said softly. Let's talk about this. She shook her head again, her breathing shallow and erratic. Talk? You want to talk? About what, Richard? About how my whole life is a lie. About how the woman who changed my diapers, who cleaned up after me for years, is my mother. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He, too, was at a loss for words. Eleanor, standing there like a ghost of her past, felt the deep chasm widening between her and Vanessa. This wasn't how she had wanted it to go. She had imagined a moment of reconciliation, a chance to explain everything, but now it was clear that Vanessa wasn't ready to hear it. You have every right to be angry, Eleanor said quietly, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you, but please understand, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped being your mother, even when I wasn't allowed to be. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh, her eyes wild with disbelief. You call this love? This isn't love. This is manipulation. This is cruelty. She glanced toward Richard, as if searching for some kind of reassurance, but his face mirrored the confusion she felt. Suddenly, a painful memory resurfaced in Vanessa's mind, one she hadn't thought about in years. You knew everything, she muttered, her voice hollow. You knew about all of it, the breakdowns, the pressure, and you did nothing. You let me fall apart, over and over, and you just watched. Eleanor's face twisted with regret, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her like a heavy stone. I didn't know how to help you, Vanessa, she admitted. I wasn't allowed to be there for you the way I wanted to. I couldn't cross that line, but you let me drown. Vanessa screamed, her voice raw with pain. You let me believe I was broken. All those years, when I needed someone the most, you could have told me, and you didn't. Richard's hand finally settled on Vanessa's shoulder, trying to ground her, but she shrugged him off, her body rigid with fury. This whole family, this whole life, it's all a lie. Vanessa spat, her eyes blazing with anger. You, Richard, the Harlows, none of you ever cared about me. Richard's face fell, his hand retreating as he realized the gravity of what Vanessa was saying. He had always been distant, emotionally detached, but he never thought Vanessa would see it that way. He had always assumed she knew how much he cared, at least in his own way. Vanessa, he began, his voice low and uncertain. I never. But Vanessa wasn't listening. She turned back to Eleanor, her mother, her voice now low and trembling. I can't do this right now. I need space. I need to think. Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to reach out, but she knew better. Vanessa was a storm, and nothing Eleanor could say would calm her right now. Vanessa brushed past her without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she left the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest as she fled the house. The weight of the truth was too much to bear, and she needed to escape, to breathe, to figure out who she even was anymore. Eleanor stood frozen in place, her heart breaking all over again as the door slammed behind Vanessa. The truth was out, but the damage it caused was more than she had ever imagined. In the suffocating silence that followed, Richard looked at Eleanor, his face hardening with a mix of anger and confusion. What happens now? He asked quietly, his voice cold. Eleanor, tears streaming down her face, shook her head, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the years and the secret she had carried for so long. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know. Richard stood in the middle of the kitchen, his expression hard and unreadable, as the sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house. Vanessa was gone, her footsteps fading into the night as she fled the mansion, leaving behind the wreckage of everything she had ever known. Eleanor remained standing by the counter, her body heavy with exhaustion and guilt. She watched Richard for a moment, her heart aching in ways she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about Vanessa anymore. The truth had spilled out, and now she had to face Richard, the man who had unknowingly been at the center of it all. Richard's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for answers that weren't there. He had spent years mastering control over his business, over his family, over his life. But tonight, that control had been ripped from him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to regain it. He finally looked up at Eleanor, his gaze sharp, though beneath it lay a deep confusion. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice low but edged with anger. All these years, Eleanor. You could have told me. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. I wanted to, she admitted softly. There were so many times I wanted to tell you. But how could I? How could I tell you that your wife, the woman you thought you knew, was my daughter? That the life you built was based on a lie? Richard shook his head, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. A lie? He muttered, more to himself than to her. You think this is just a lie? You've destroyed everything, Eleanor. You've broken this family apart. Eleanor felt her chest tighten at his words. I never wanted to break anything, Richard. I stayed silent because I thought I was doing the right thing. For Vanessa, for you, For all of us. I thought if I just stayed in the background, I could protect her, protect this life. But I was wrong. Damn right you were wrong. Richard shot back, his voice rising. You should have told us. Vanessa deserved to know who she really is. I deserve to know. Eleanor winced at his words, the guilt weighing heavily on her. I know I hurt you both, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But you have to understand, Richard, back then, I didn't have a choice. The Harlows forced me to give her up. They didn't want the scandal. They wanted to raise her as their own, and her voice broke, and she paused, gathering her composure. I wasn't strong enough to fight them. I was young, alone, and I was terrified. Richard's eyes softened slightly, but his jaw remained clenched. So you just gave her up and stayed here? In this house? Watching us? Watching me? Pretending that none of it mattered? I stayed because I couldn't leave her, Eleanor said, her voice raw with emotion. I couldn't bear the thought of being completely cut off from her. This was the only way I could be close to her, even if it meant hiding who I really was. Richard turned away, pacing across the kitchen, his mind racing. The pieces of his life were falling apart around him, and the woman standing before him. This woman he had always seen as nothing more than a loyal housekeeper, was at the center of it all. He had never thought much about Eleanor, never questioned her presence in their home. She had always been there, like a piece of furniture, invisible yet indispensable. But now, everything about her felt foreign, dangerous. Eleanor watched him, her heart breaking with each step he took. She had seen him in moments of power and vulnerability over the years, but she had never seen him like this, so lost, so uncertain. Richard, please, she said gently. I know this is hard to accept, but everything I did was out of love. I loved Vanessa then, and I love her now. I didn't want to destroy her life. Richard stopped, his back to her. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the emotions were too strong, too tangled. He turned slowly to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. Love? He asked bitterly. You think this is love? What you've done, what you've hidden, has nothing to do with love. You lied to her. You lied to me. You've been lying to us for 30 years. Eleanor felt the sting of his words, but she stood her ground. I was trying to protect her, Richard. I was trying to protect you, too. I didn't want to bring this pain into your lives. Richard laughed bitterly, shaking his head. And how well did that work out? Look at where we are now. Vanessa's gone. Her whole world shattered. My world. His voice broke, and he looked away, the weight of the situation crushing him. I don't even know who I am in this anymore. The room fell into silence again, both of them standing on opposite sides of the kitchen, two people whose lives had been inextricably linked but who now felt like strangers. Eleanor wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but she knew it was too late for that. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Richard's shoulders slumped, the exhaustion finally settling in. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing everything there was to know about the people in his life. But tonight, he realized just how little he truly understood. What do I even tell Vanessa? He muttered, almost to himself. How do I make her understand any of this? Eleanor shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know, she said quietly. I don't know if you can. She has every right to hate me right now. But, Richard, you can help her. You've always been there for her, even when you didn't know the truth. That doesn't have to change. Richard looked up at her, his face pale and drawn. How can you say that? How can you act like everything can just go back to normal? I'm not saying that, Eleanor replied, her voice trembling. I know nothing will ever be the same. But she still needs you, Richard. You're her husband. She's going to need someone to help her through this, to help her make sense of it. And what about you? Richard asked, his voice quieter now, less accusatory. What do you want, Eleanor? After all this, what do you want from us? Eleanor hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent so many years dreaming of a day when the truth would come out, but now that it had, she realized she didn't know what she wanted. Reconciliation? Forgiveness? Did she even deserve that? I don't know, she finally said, her voice soft and unsure. I just want Vanessa to understand why I did what I did. I want her to know that, despite everything, I've always loved her. I don't expect her to forgive me, but I hope she can." Richard stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving Eleanor standing alone, the quiet echo of his footsteps disappearing down the hall. As the silence settled around her, Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had just happened. She had spent so many years preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt utterly lost. What would Vanessa do? Would she ever come back? Would she ever understand why Eleanor had made the choices she had? Eleanor didn't have the answers. All she could do now was wait. But the waiting, she knew, would be the hardest part of all. Vanessa drove through the quiet streets of Manhattan, the city lights blurring through her tears as she gripped the steering wheel tightly. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, drowning out the chaotic storm of thoughts crashing through her mind. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of anger, confusion, and betrayal. Her mother, Eleanor, the woman she had scorned, humiliated, and treated like a shadow in her life, was her mother. How was that even possible? How could someone hide something so enormous, so life-altering, for so long? Vanessa had spent her entire life chasing perfection, clawing her way to the top of New York society, ensuring the Harlow name was untarnished, that everything about her life was curated and flawless. Now, all of it felt like a lie. All of it felt meaningless. She pulled the car over to the side of the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were trembling so much she could barely keep them on the wheel. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the flood of memories that came rushing back. All the times Eleanor had been there, silent, watchful, like a ghost in the background of her life. The way Eleanor had always seemed to know when something was wrong, offering quiet comfort even when Vanessa had brushed her off with cold indifference. The way she had never understood why she felt something more toward Eleanor, something deeper, something she could never explain. And now she knew. The woman who had been in her life all along, the one she had treated as less than human, was her mother. The truth stung like a slap to the face. Vanessa's chest tightened, the pain of it overwhelming. She had spent years despising Eleanor, blaming her for everything that went wrong, for the emotional distance she felt, for the constant pressure to be perfect. And now, it all felt so warped, so twisted. Eleanor had been her mother this whole time, suffering in silence while Vanessa raged against the world. Vanessa slammed her hands against the steering wheel, a scream of frustration escaping her lips. She had no idea how to handle this. She had spent so long building a life based on a foundation that no longer existed. Who was she now? Vanessa Harlow, wife of Richard, queen of New York's elite? Or was she Vanessa Harper, the daughter of a woman who had spent her life cleaning up after others? She hated it. She hated how helpless she felt, how powerless this revelation made her. For so long, Vanessa had wielded control like a weapon, commanding her life with precision and authority. But now, that control was gone. Everything was spinning, and she couldn't stop it. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in the seat next to her, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. It was Richard. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone. Her instinct was to ignore it, but something inside her, a need for stability, for familiarity, made her answer. "Vanessa." Richard's voice came through the line, low and concerned. "Where are you?" "I don't know," she replied honestly, her voice barely audible. I'm just driving." There was a pause on the other end. "Come home," Richard said softly. "We need to talk." Vanessa swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She couldn't go back. Not yet. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Richard." "Yes, you do," Richard said firmly. "You're Vanessa Harlow. You're my wife. This changes things, but it doesn't change you." His words should have comforted her, but they didn't. They only reminded her of how hollow everything felt now. "It changes everything, Richard," she said, her voice rising in frustration. "Everything I've ever known, Everything I've ever built. It's all a lie." "It's not a lie," Richard argued, his voice steady but tense. "Your life isn't a lie, Vanessa. Yes, the truth about Eleanor is shocking, but it doesn't erase who you are. It doesn't erase us." Vanessa's grip tightened on the phone, her anger bubbling to the surface. "How can you say that?" she snapped. "How can you act like this isn't the most devastating thing that's ever happened to me? I've been living in a fantasy, and now I find out that the one person I thought I knew least is my mother." There was another long pause, and Vanessa could hear Richard's breath on the other end of the line, steady but strained. "I don't have all the answers, Vanessa," he said finally, his voice softer now. "But running isn't going to help. Come home. We'll figure it out together." Vanessa closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could figure this out, that they could rebuild from this wreckage. But the pain was too fresh, too raw. The truth had fractured her sense of self, and she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. "I'll come back," she said after a long pause, her voice barely a whisper. "But not tonight." Richard didn't argue. He knew better than to push her when she was like this. "Okay," he said softly, "but promise me you'll come back." Vanessa hesitated, then nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I promise." When the call ended, she sat in the car for a long time, staring out at the city streets, her mind numb. The world outside moved on, unaffected by the turmoil inside her, and she felt like she was drifting, unmoored from everything she once held on to. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Richard sat in the darkened living room, his phone still in his hand. The party had long since ended, and the house was eerily quiet now, the weight of the evening settling in like a thick fog. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He had spent years building an empire, maintaining control over every aspect of his life. But tonight had ripped that control away from him, and he didn't know how to handle the fallout. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Eleanor had stood just hours ago, revealing the truth that had shattered everything. Eleanor, the woman he had trusted for decades, the woman who had quietly managed their household with an unflinching loyalty, was Vanessa's mother. He still couldn't wrap his mind around it. As he sat in the silence, the reality of what that meant began to settle in. The betrayal, the lies. He wasn't sure how to feel about any of it. But more than anything, he worried for Vanessa. She was strong, but this would break anyone. And she wasn't just his wife anymore. She was the daughter of a woman who had spent her life cleaning floors and serving meals. Richard knew they had to face this together, but the truth was, he didn't know if Vanessa would ever recover from this. He didn't know if their marriage, their life, could survive the weight of it all. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She stood there for a moment, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if she belonged in this part of the house anymore. "Richard," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. "I know Vanessa isn't here, but can we talk?" Richard stared at her for a long moment, the anger and confusion swirling in his chest. But beneath it all, he saw something else in her eyes, something raw and vulnerable. She had spent her life serving them, hiding her pain, and now, for the first time, she was asking for something. Understanding, maybe, forgiveness, or just a chance to explain. He gestured for her to sit, his voice tight. "We should talk," he said. Eleanor nodded, stepping into the room, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. And so, in the quiet of the Harlow mansion, the conversations that should have happened decades ago were about to begin. But neither of them knew where those conversations would lead, or whether any of them could survive what came next. Eleanor sat down slowly across from Richard, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the tension between them almost palpable. The vast living room felt colder now, the air heavy with everything unsaid. It was late, and the house was unnervingly quiet without the hum of party guests or the bustle of servants. The truth had silenced everything. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at her, his face unreadable. Eleanor could see the anger and confusion flickering in his eyes, the kind of hurt that went deep, a betrayal he hadn't expected. She had feared this moment for years, this reckoning, and now that it was here, she felt stripped bare, vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in decades. "I don't even know where to start," Richard said finally, his voice low but tense. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. "How could you keep something like this from me? From us? All these years, Eleanor. Why?" Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet sorrow. "I didn't want it to be this way, Richard," she said softly. "I never wanted this to happen. But back then, when I had Vanessa, I didn't have a choice." Richard's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "No choice? You had years to tell me, years to explain everything. But you didn't. You let us live a lie." Eleanor sighed, her fingers trembling slightly. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting Vanessa, protecting you. You and your family." She paused, swallowing hard. "The Harlows. They made it clear that Vanessa's future was better with them. I was just the housekeeper. What could I have given her? A life of struggle? I didn't want that for her." Richard's eyes narrowed. "But you stayed here," he said, the accusation in his voice unmistakable. "You stayed in this house, cleaning our floors, serving us, watching Vanessa grow up. How could you do that?" Eleanor blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had asked herself the same question countless times over the years. "Because I couldn't leave her," she whispered. "Even if she didn't know the truth, I couldn't bear to be away from her. I stayed to be close to her, to watch over her, even if it meant staying in the shadows." Richard stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the room, his frustration boiling over. "And you think that makes it okay? You think that justifies lying to her all these years?" "I never said it was okay," Eleanor replied, her voice steady but filled with pain. "I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to tell her without destroying everything she believed in. I thought it would ruin her." Richard stopped and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "And look where we are now. It's ruined anyway." Eleanor flinched at his words, knowing they were true. The life she had built around Vanessa, this delicate balance of love and secrecy, had crumbled in an instant. And now, all she had left was the wreckage. Richard's shoulders slumped as he let out a long breath, the weight of the night pressing down on him. "What do you want from us, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice softer now, less accusatory. "What do you want from Vanessa?" Eleanor hesitated, the question hitting her like a punch to the gut. She had spent so long imagining what might happen if the truth ever came out, but now that it had, she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. Reconciliation seemed impossible. Forgiveness felt too far away. But there was one thing she knew she couldn't walk away from. "I want her to know the truth," Eleanor said quietly. "I want her to understand why I did what I did. I want her to know that I never stopped loving her, even when I had to give her up. I don't expect her to forgive me, Richard. I know I don't deserve that. But she deserves the truth, and She stopped, her voice trembling. "I need her to know how much I've always cared for her." Richard's expression softened, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. He sat down across from her again, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of the impossible situation they were in. "She's hurt, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentler now. "This is a lot for her to process. She needs time." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice small. "I know she does, and I'll give her all the time she needs. But I'm afraid that she'll never come back, that I'll never get the chance to make things right." Richard shook his head, his gaze drifting to the window where the night stretched out beyond the mansion's pristine gardens. "Vanessa is strong," he said quietly, "stronger than anyone gives her credit for. She'll come back. She just needs to figure out who she is now." Eleanor nodded, though her heart ached at the thought. She had seen Vanessa's strength over the years, but she had also seen her vulnerability, the moments when Vanessa felt like the world was too much, the weight of perfection too heavy. And now, that weight was unbearable. "She's going to hate me," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She already does." Richard didn't answer immediately, his mind working through the complexity of their situation. He wanted to comfort Eleanor, to reassure her that things would eventually be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know if they ever would be. He didn't know if Vanessa would ever forgive her. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice quiet. "But she needs time. You need to let her decide what she wants." Eleanor wiped at her eyes, nodding. She had already prepared herself for the possibility that Vanessa might never come back. But hearing Richard say it out loud made the reality of it sink in even deeper. She had spent so long keeping her distance, telling herself it was for Vanessa's own good. And now, it might have cost her everything. Richard stood up again, running a hand through his hair as he stared out the window. "This changes things for me, too," he said, almost to himself. "Everything about our lives, about Vanessa's life. I don't know what our marriage looks like now, Eleanor. I don't know how we move forward from this." Eleanor looked down, feeling the weight of his words. She had caused a rift between them, a fracture in the foundation of their lives. And now, it wasn't just her relationship with Vanessa that was at stake. It was Richard's too. "I didn't want to hurt you, Richard," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt either of you," Richard sighed, turning to face her again. "I know, but you did." The words were blunt, but Eleanor couldn't argue with them. She had hurt them both deeply, and there was no undoing that. "I don't know what's going to happen," Richard continued. "I don't know what Vanessa's going to do, but I do know one thing." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You've got to be patient. You owe her that." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I will. I'll wait as long as it takes." The silence between them lingered, heavy and thick with unspoken feelings. There was nothing more to say, nothing that could change the truth that had already been revealed. But as Eleanor stood to leave, Richard's voice stopped her. "I don't hate you," he said quietly, his eyes filled with a complicated mixture of emotions. "I just don't know how to forgive you yet." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat, but she nodded, understanding. Forgiveness wasn't something she could ask for right now. It had to come on its own, if it came at all. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With that, she left the room, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallways of the mansion she had called home for so many years. But now, it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place filled with ghosts, ghosts of secrets, of lost time, of a family she had always been a part of but never fully belonged to. As she reached her small quarters at the far end of the mansion, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed photo of Vanessa as a child, the one she had kept hidden for years. She traced her finger over Vanessa's face, the little girl who had no idea who she really was. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." And as the night stretched on, she wondered if she would ever hear her daughter's voice again, or if the silence would be all that was left. Weeks passed after that tumultuous night at the Harlow mansion, and the air around the house grew heavier with each passing day. Vanessa had not returned. Her absence was a ghost that lingered in every room, every corner of the estate. Richard went through the motions of his daily life, business meetings, charity functions, but there was an emptiness to it all, a sense of waiting for something to happen that never did. Eleanor remained in the house, though her presence felt even more invisible than before. She still tended to her duties, cleaning and organizing as she always had, but now there was a hollowness to the rhythm of her work. She lived in a quiet state of limbo, hoping each day that Vanessa might come back, that her daughter might give her a chance to explain further, to mend what had been broken. But each day, that hope dimmed a little more. It had been nearly a month since the truth had come out, and Eleanor's heart ached with the weight of it all. She spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life by revealing the secret. She had imagined countless scenarios where the truth brought healing, but none where it brought this profound silence. One gray autumn afternoon, as Eleanor polished the silver in the dining room, she heard the faint sound of a car pulling up the long driveway. Her heart quickened, but she tried to temper her expectations. She had heard that sound too many times before, only for it to be a delivery, a contractor, anyone but Vanessa. But this time, something felt different. Eleanor wiped her hands on a cloth, her breath catching in her throat as she heard the front door open. Footsteps echoed through the grand entryway, slow and deliberate. She stood still, her heart pounding, until she saw her. Vanessa. Her daughter stepped into the room, dressed in a long coat, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked tired, as if the weeks away had drained her, but there was a clarity in her eyes that Eleanor hadn't seen before. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence thick and almost unbearable. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and fear. Was this the moment she had been waiting for? Or was it just another chance for Vanessa to lash out, to make it clear that forgiveness was impossible? Vanessa's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "We need to talk." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak as she wiped her trembling hands once more. "Of course," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Vanessa walked over to the dining room table, the very table where they had shared so many meals together. Unaware of the truth that lay beneath their relationship, she sat down, her movements slow, as if she were carrying the weight of everything she had been grappling with for the past few weeks. Eleanor hesitated, unsure if she should sit, but after a moment, she crossed the room and sat across from Vanessa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room felt too large, the space between them too wide. Eleanor didn't know how to close the gap, how to reach across the chasm that had grown between them. Vanessa's eyes were fixed on the table, her fingers tracing the wood grain as if grounding herself for what she was about to say. "I've been staying at a friend's place," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I needed time to think, time away from all of this." Eleanor nodded slowly, her heart aching at the thought of Vanessa needing to be far from the house they had shared for so long. "I understand," she said softly. Vanessa's gaze lifted to meet Eleanor's, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes that Eleanor couldn't quite place. "I'm not here to pretend everything's fine," Vanessa continued, her voice growing firmer. "It's not. What you did, what you kept from me, hurt more than I can put into words." Eleanor's throat tightened, and she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Vanessa. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought—" "I know what you thought," Vanessa interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've had weeks to think about it. I know you thought you were protecting me. I know you believed you were doing the right thing. But you weren't." Eleanor looked down at her hands, her fingers clutching the edge of her apron. She had nothing to say in her defense. Everything Vanessa said was true. She had failed her, in ways that were hard to forgive. Vanessa took a deep breath, her voice softening slightly. "I didn't come here to yell at you. I've done enough of that in my head already. I came here because I needed to understand." Eleanor looked up, her eyes full of unshed tears. "Understand what?" Vanessa hesitated, her fingers still tracing the lines in the table. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you ever say anything? Not even when I was an adult. You could have explained. You could have tried to reach me." Eleanor's heart broke at the question, her voice trembling as she answered. "I was afraid," she admitted, her eyes glistening. "I was afraid that if I told you, I would lose you forever. I thought, if I stayed in your life, even as your housekeeper, at least I would still be a part of it. I couldn't bear the thought of you hating me." Vanessa's eyes softened, though there was still pain there. "But don't you see? By not telling me, you did lose me. I didn't even know who you were." Eleanor let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I see that now," she whispered. "I was wrong. I should have told you. I should have been brave enough to be honest with you, no matter the consequences." The room fell into a heavy silence again, the weight of Eleanor's words hanging between them. Vanessa's expression shifted, her anger softening into something more complicated, something that Eleanor could only hope was the beginning of understanding. "I've been angry for a long time," Vanessa said, her voice quiet. "Not just because of this. I've been angry at myself, at my life, at everything. And I think, deep down, part of that anger came from not knowing where I came from. I always felt like something was missing." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she nodded, tears spilling over now. "I'm so sorry you had to feel that way. I never wanted that for you." Vanessa shook her head, wiping at her own eyes. I know, and I believe you. She paused, her fingers still on the table, before she looked up again. But I don't know how to move forward from this. I don't know how to suddenly have a mother who's been in my life all along, without me knowing. Eleanor's heart squeezed painfully, but she didn't push. She knew that healing would take time. You don't have to know right now, she said gently. We can take it one day at a time. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I don't even know if I deserve that. Vanessa looked at her, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something between them. Something fragile but real. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted. But I want to try. I want to figure out who we are now, if that's even possible. Eleanor's breath hitched, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and sorrow. That's all I've ever wanted, she said softly. Just a chance to try. Vanessa nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. Then we'll try. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything still heavy. But now there was something new, a fragile connection, a willingness to move forward, even if the path was uncertain. Vanessa stood slowly, and Eleanor followed suit, unsure if this was the end of the conversation or the beginning of something more. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment, then stepped forward and, with hesitation, wrapped her arms around Eleanor in a tentative embrace. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. As Eleanor held her daughter for the first time as more than just a housekeeper, more than just a hidden figure in the background of Vanessa's life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. It wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of hope. And for now, that was enough.